In 2008, I was living in Kyoto in Japan. It was an artist residency. And I began to do some research on the far left. I was very surprised to learn that May '68 in Japan, in Tokyo, was perhaps more of an explosive event than it was even in Paris. And so I was researching the student movement and then the fringes of the student movement that radicalized and that went underground. And that's how I came across the story of the Japanese Red Army. Fusako Shigenobu, who founded the Japanese Red Army and who later went to Lebanon and then founded the Japanese Red Army, was a character that interested me, but there's very little about her, very little published, very little, there's very few documents. It's a very secretive period of history. And that's why I became interested in making a film that would revolve around the Japanese Red Army, but without addressing the film, researching the film around her rather than with her. She's in prison now, but I thought it would be more interesting to sort of look around the story rather than the center of the story. So Mei Shigenobu, who's her daughter, and Masao Adachi, who was one of several members of the Japanese Red Army, but he was of particular interest to me because he comes from the film world, from the experimental film world, and his passage from the film world to the world of armed struggle is an interesting passage. Few filmmakers have actually gone past a certain point. They make political films, but they generally stay with the camera in hand. Masao Adachi has theorized very much his passage to the other side. I think in any documentary system, there's a transaction between the author or the subjects. Mostly the transaction is tacit. It's not necessarily inscribed inside of the form of the documentary itself, but there's always a transaction. And I don't come from the documentary tradition, so to speak. I'm a visual artist initially. And I knew that I wanted to make a film that was dealing with documentary materials. But if I was going to do that, I wanted the nature of the transaction with Masao Adachi to be inscribed inside of the film itself. So when I contacted him and we met, he said, I'll tell you a story, but in exchange, I would like you to make images for me in Lebanon because I cannot go to Lebanon anymore. And so I thought that was a very interesting exchange, a story against images that he could then use in his own films because he cannot be in Lebanon. And this was the starting point of building the relationship with him and constructing the film around this ambiguous relationship and transaction. The transaction with Mei Shigenobu is not necessarily, doesn't need to be explicitly explained in the film because it comes out in a different way. It comes out in the way in which Mei tells her story. We understand that she is a storyteller and she has always been a storyteller. And in that sense, I'm an oral historian who's also letting somebody provide a new version, a different version of a story that she's told in a book that she's told several times. And so putting her story and constructing a film with Masao Adachi's story, and he is a filmmaker, offers all kinds of possibilities that are not simply the biographical telling of two stories, but constructing something in between these two stories.